the Western mind to sleep at precisely the time when Asia, especially China and India, were waking up. That from the year 1 to the year 1820, the two largest economies of the world were always those of China and India, always. The thing that's really crazy about this is that the long-term threat to Europe doesn't come from Russia or Russian tanks.
In this fascinating video, Professor Kishore Mahbubani dives into why the West, especially the United States and Europe, are on the decline, while Asia, particularly China and India, is on the rise. Trust me, you'll want to hear his take on the shifting global power dynamics.
By the way, you're absolutely right. The one country in which I've spent the most amount of time outside of Singapore is the United States of America. I mean, 10.5 years in New York, 2.5 years in Washington, D.C., 1 year in Harvard, and many other visits and so on and so forth. So, I mean, I've grown to like and respect the United States of America a great deal. And I should also add a very important personal note. I also got married twice in the US. So I guess my heart was pulled to the United States. And incidentally, I was introduced to my wife and by an American diplomat too. So I developed deep friendships in the United States. So there's no question that if you are a young, aspiring individual who has, a lot of beans, or like Satya Nadella, you're like Sundar Pichai, you can arrive as a young immigrant and do very, very well in the United States of America. There's no question. But at the same time, in terms of its foreign policy, unfortunately, the United States has been making more and more mistakes. And it's a good question to ask why that is the case. But one of the theories I'm developing is that in the Cold War, in one way or another, the Soviet Union acted as a major restraint on the United States, and the United States felt that it was in a real competition to win hearts and minds around the world. And American diplomats actually were in the Cold War very friendly, oozing with charm, and always trying to persuade you that, the United States was on the right side of history, the Soviet Union was on the wrong side. And in a sense, you had American diplomats, American leaders making an effort to cultivate the world and get to know it. I can tell you, like, someone like George Shultz, the Secretary of State, would spend 3 weeks traveling all around the Asia-Pacific region, and someone asking, why are you spending 3 weeks here? He says, I'm taking care of the garden. You got to spend time. You got to meet people. You got to hear them out. You got to understand what they think, and so on and so forth. So that was the nature of American diplomacy during the Cold War. But unfortunately, when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union ended, I have absolutely no doubt that what brought America down was that America got drowned in hubris. And we all know the famous end of history essay. And the most damaging part of the end of history of essay was that it actually made those in the United States and the West feel, hey, we won. So from now on, the rest of the world has got to converge towards us and become like us, liberal democratic societies. And so they have to do all the adjustment adaptations. We have arrived, we don't have to change and adapt. And I spent a year in Harvard in 91, 92, immediately after the end of the Cold War. And I can tell you the sheer arrogance, complacency of everyone in the United States then was actually quite shocking. And I remember in a discussion with the very famous, a very good man, I must say, a very good man, Stanley Hoffman, one of the best professors in Harvard. And after a discussion on the state of the world, I said, by the way, I don't think the future belongs to the West. I think, Asia is returning, and the 21st century will be the Asian century. And he went almost apoplectic, in his response. He couldn't believe that anyone would say that the West was not going to command history forever. But the fact that even a great intellectual citadel like Harvard could be consumed by such arrogance showed that, the end of the Cold War did a lot of damage to the American mind, to the Western mind. Because what it did was that it put the Western mind to sleep at precisely the time when Asia, especially China and India, were waking up. And I'm shocked that very few Americans know that from the year 1 to the year 1820, the two largest economies of the world were always those of China and India, always. And so the past 200 years of Western domination of world history have been a major historical aberration. All aberrations come to a natural end. And at precisely the moment when the aberration was going to begin to come to an end, as China and India were waking up, United States and the rest of the world went to sleep. And as a consequence of that, I think many Americans, forgot the discipline, forgot the lessons of the Cold War, and stopped trying to understand the rest of the world. And so one of the things I try to do as a friend of the United States with my books is to say, hey, why don't you step back and see what the rest of the world thinks? Because most of the world, I can tell you, is not anti-American. Definitely not. But at the same time, they also want to be able to make their own decisions and not be forced to take positions because, you come along and say, hey, your government is not good enough. We have to change and adapt your government. I mean, that's arrogant to tell societies with long histories that you know better than them how they should be governed. And those sorts of sloppy intellectual habits. Plus, I think the one other consequence of the end of the Cold War is that you no longer had big picture strategic thinkers, like, Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, even who sort of realized that what you got to do is look at the whole picture and not just look at sections of it. But you lost these big picture thinkers in the United States. And I think that's part of the reason why the United States geopolitically seems to be, relatively speaking, lost in the world. But over the course of the years of working in international affairs and geopolitics, I began to realize, especially after my 2 years in the Security Council in the years 2001, 2002, that when you get a clash between power and principle, power always trumps principle. It's always considerations of power will determine the final outcome, which is why it's very, very important to be geopolitically realistic, And so when I look at the world today, for example, to take a practical example, I'm actually astonished by the geopolitical incompetence of the European Union. And I say this because the European Union, and the Europeans are smart, sophisticated people, they cannot claim they don't know history, should have realized that they have to learn to live with Russia for the next 100 years, Now, of course, many of them, because they got seduced by the end of history argument, believe that they would never have to adapt to Russia. But Russia will, of course, eventually have to change, drop off all its communist, autocratic clothing and become a clone of Western Europe, and then the problem will be solved. See, that's a completely wrong ahistorical view. And they fail to understand that other societies are going to make their choices and have their own concerns. So when the Russians consistently protested against the expansion of NATO, and they were sending very, very clear signals that if you keep on expanding, I have to react. All these warning signals were ignored by the Europeans. And I can tell you, before Henry Kissinger died, a year before he died, I had a one-on-one conversation with him in his office, and he was sort of hinting that the Europeans have, in a sense, forgotten the art of doing realistic, long-term geopolitical thinking and trying to find out and figure out solutions, win-win solutions for everybody whenever you have a problem. And so in the eyes of the rest of the world, even though they don't approve of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because the Russian invasion of Ukraine is illegal, let's be clear about that. The UN Charter is very clear about that, and we cannot approve of it. Yet, when the West imposed sanctions on Russia, 85% of the world's population didn't impose sanctions on Russia. And if I was someone in the West, I would say, excuse me, our goal was to isolate Russia, do we end up isolating Russia or isolating ourselves vis-a-vis the rest of the world? And the Europeans were also massively hypocritical when they criticized the global south for keeping up their ties with Russia, because they themselves were secretly shipping gas, even through Ukraine, into Europe, all for the first 3 years of the war. I mean, they were lying to the rest of the world. And plus, the Europeans were also knowingly buying Russian oil, which had been refined in India. They knew it was Russian oil. So, I mean, all this hypocrisy is so evident. And therefore, it's time for the Europeans, I believe, and I say this as a friend of Europe, I want Europe to do well. It's time for Europe to wake up and realize that it can enhance its options best by being geopolitically realistic and carve out a position of strategic autonomy for Europe, where Europe can certainly cooperate very, very closely with the United States, but Europe should retain the option to cooperate closely with any other power it wants to, whether it's Russia, China, or India, or anyone else. But, because, at the end of the day, the thing that's really crazy about this is that the long-term threat to Europe doesn't come from Russia or Russian tanks. It comes from the demographic explosion in Africa that is happening. And in the long, in the year 1950, Europe's population was double that of Africa's. Today, Africa's population is 2.5 times the size of Europe. By 2100, it'll be 10 times the size of Europe. So, clearly what you should do is focus your strategic sights on what's really important. And the reason I can confidently say that Russia will never be a threat to Europe is because Russia's biggest worry is not Europe. Russia's biggest worry is that its longest border is with China. And remember this, during the Cold War, Soviet Union was up here, China was down here. And the Soviet Union was kicking China around, and they almost came to war in 1969. Now, today, the situation has changed. China is here. Russia is here. You think Russia wants to take a fight with Europe? I mean, if the Europeans had any kind of strategic common sense, they would say, hey, Russia's got bigger worries. Now, let me find a way of dealing with Russia in such a way that I don't alienate them and I can focus on what I'm doing. Because, you mentioned that the goal of the Quincy Institute is to prevent wars. And, I've also launched something called the Asian Peace Program to try and prevent wars in Asia. The thing that's sad is that if the Europeans had any kind of geopolitical realism, or if they had the quality of mind of Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, Rajaratnam, they could have easily prevented the Ukraine war. So it was sheer geopolitical incompetence that has led to this Ukraine war.